show students how to properly glaze using 3 different techniques. As you can see from these pictures, there are a wide variety of color possibilities as you work on your pieces. Through stain decoration and various glaze colors, you can create a very appealing appearance on the surface of your pot. In these pots that we've gathered here, you can see a wide variety of colors as well. Deep blues with gold luster overglaze, stain rubbed into deep texture on a pot with a Hatakaki lip. That little goblet has a copper red glaze on it. The coil pot in the back has a spodumene. This color inlay striped pot here has Shainer's clear on it. In high fire there are many possible color combinations. The glazed tile board gives you an example of the glazes that are generally mixed or that can be mixed in the ceramics classroom for use on your pots. In today's how-to glazing video, we're going to take you first through the steps of spraying a glaze. You'll learn how to stir and test a glaze, use the glaze sprayer, how to strain it so that it works properly, how to use the spray booth, the proper steps in spraying glaze on bisqueware, and how you can do some variations that make your piece more interesting, like antiquing or sandwiching. And finally, we'll talk about dry footing and cleaning the lids and rims in jars. Once you've selected your glaze, this one is glossy deep blue-green, you need to open the bucket and take a look at it. This one has a lot of water floating on the top. It's going to need a lot of stirring. Putting your hand way down deep inside and stirring from the bottom up until all of the glaze is evenly distributed throughout the water. Some students who think, well, I'll just take a ruler or something and just kind of lightly stir it. Unfortunately, the glaze settles so hard, some of them are almost like cement on the bottom. If you don't get your hand all the way into the bottom and squidge the viscous lumps of clay out and smooth it thoroughly into the water, you're not going to have a good mix. Sometimes I get students who think that Janie just mixed the glaze 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago, so they use it because they're too lazy to stir it. And then their pot ends up with dry surface, not enough glaze, because the glaze has already started to settle. Dry your hands, and then you're ready to test the glaze and see if it's a proper consistency for using. Dip a dry finger into the glaze and check it. If it coats your finger but shows the shape of your fingernail, it's just right. If, on the other hand, it shows your skin color through the glaze, it's too thin, and if it gobs thickly enough that you can't see the shape of your fingernail, it's too thick. Here you see a spray gun and can. The spray gun should be cleaned and rinsed off before you try to use it. The last person who used it should have rinsed it off. As you look at this one, you'll see that it's quite top-heavy. And when you first put glaze in it, it works reasonably well to just set it anywhere, but after you've sprayed for a minute or two, it gets light enough at the bottom that it will tip over and crash on the floor. And this breaks a very expensive spray tip and spray gun assembly. So it's important that you use the welded holders that are at the side of the spray booth when you go out to use them. Now, to make sure this is going to work well, run water through the siphon straw in the sprayer. You can see how it squirts freely out the other end. That means this was cleaned properly last time and it's ready to use. Whenever you spray a glaze, you must run the glaze through a strainer. And the reason is that you'll get tiny lumps in the glaze that will catch in the spray mechanism and clog the sprayer. You'll be really frustrated if you try to do it without straining. It's well worth taking the time to strain the glaze. Wash any funnels, strainers, cups that you've used and make sure that they get put back where you got them. Easiest way to screw it on is to kind of swivel like Mr. Bennett's doing here. And as soon as it's on, you're ready to hook it up. Here you can see the spray gun sitting in the welded holder to the side of the spray booth. And here are 2 spray booths to be used for spray glazing. The artist is going to line the spray booth with paper to make it easier to clean up afterwards. And he's put in a turntable to make it easier to rotate the pot. Spray glaze runs on air pressure, and so we have quick disconnect couplers. You slide back the first sleeve, push it on, and then release the sleeve, and it's connected. Next thing you need to do is turn on the air. When the air is lined up with the pipe, the air is on. And when the green lever is across the pipe, then the air is off. There is a switch for an exhaust fan toward the back of the spray booth. Flip that on. Always start with your pot upside down. The reason for this is that the spray only goes in a straight line. And if you only spray from up above, what will happen is the pot will be very bare of glaze on all undersides. You want the glaze to land and dry pretty near immediately. If it takes too long to dry, then you need to back up your sprayer a little bit, let it land dry. You're trying to build up a woolly or mossy texture on the glaze. You notice that the artist is taking special care inside those clay loops to get the glaze to stick down in those, because it's very difficult to get it to glaze down in those. You never have enough glaze unless the color of the pot is hidden and only the color of the glaze shows. Probably the biggest mistake people make when they spray glaze is under-glazing their pot, not getting enough on. So it's really important that you spend the time and get enough on, build up a sufficient woolly or mossy texture that you know you have enough glaze on the piece. When you think you have enough glaze on the undersides of everything, the lip and underside the curve of the pot, then you need to turn it right side up and finish spraying. Spray doesn't want to go down inside a pot very well. It kind of comes back out in your face, so it's tricky to spray glaze the inside. Sometimes it's easier to pour glaze the inside and spray glaze the outside. Notice that the pot is soaking the glaze in very, very fast, and that's one of the things we need to mention here, is that you never don't pre-wet any pots that you're going to spray glaze, or they won't absorb the glaze fast enough. It takes several minutes to spray glaze a pot of this size, so be patient. It takes a little bit of time. These 3 pots here are an example of student potters not spraying long enough and not getting enough glaze on their pots. From this direction, they look reasonably bare of glaze. You can see that they didn't turn it upside down before they started spraying, because there's a definite under area there on this pot that never got glaze at all. These other 2 simply didn't spray long enough. They did it upside down for a bit, but they just didn't spray it long enough. The artist ran out of glaze, has refilled his sprayer, and is spraying some more on his piece. when you're finally finished, this piece should have a nice woolly, like sheep wool, or a texture like moss. You don't have enough glaze on until you've achieved that texture on your piece. Here we have an imprinted coil pot, and it's even more critical with those that you start upside down, because not only is the pot itself curving into an undercut, but each coil does that same undercut curve. So each coil will be dry of glaze unless you start with it upside down. The artist is switching to another spray glaze color. This is a white glaze called Marshmallow, which doesn't work very well by itself, but it makes a great glaze-on-glaze decoration. So on top of the deep glossy blue-green, which is a very dark glaze, spraying this marshmallow on top will give you a great snowflake effect on top of the first glaze. And remember that glaze-on-glaze is one of the things that you earn extra points for on your grading sheet. If the glaze colors that we have don't appeal to you, there are a number of other colors available if you use stain. Commercial stains come in a wide variety of colors that are stable at high fire temperatures. This person wanted to use Florentine green stain, but they painted it on over Shainer's clear. This isn't what we would recommend for your pieces if you want a nice even color. Another way to go would be to spray Shainer's clear or another clear glaze onto your piece. Stir up the stain that you like, put it in a spray can and spray it on, and then sandwich the stain inside another coat of clear. So what you do is spray clear, then spray stain, and then spray clear again. Doing this will give you a much more beautiful and even color than this person has. And this was Florentine green stain here. This glaze tile that I'm holding off to the left here was spray glazed with clear, then spray glazed with Florentine green stain, then spray glazed with clear again. You can see what a much more beautiful, vivid color you get when you spray all three steps. We call this sandwiching in the spray glazing technique. Another great effect, if you have heavily textured the clay surface, is to paint a stain onto the piece and scrub it off the surface of the piece. It has to be a body stain, one that can be used without a glaze. And at the top of this piece, the bottle top spouts have been sprayed with Hatakaki, which is a really nice color combination with the rust stain that was used. The lip of this square slab pot has also had a nice texture stamped into it. Stain has been brushed onto the pot and scrubbed off the surface, and then the pot has been glazed with another glaze over the top of the stain. Like the big square slab pot I just showed you a moment ago, this one has also been heavily stamped with texture, and then a dark stain has been brushed into the pot, bisque-fired pot, and then it has been scrubbed off the surface. The bottle top, the wheel-thrown bottle top on this piece has been glazed with Hatakaki. Okay, here we are antiquing this piece. Black body stain is being brushed into the stamped texture. You don't need to put it everywhere, just put it where you really need it. And there's less scrubbing to do. And take a wide flat sponge and carefully clean the surface of the piece, leaving that stain down in those crevices. Looks great. Now that the stain is into the textured areas of the pot, this pot could be glazed a number of ways. It could be spray glazed over the top, it could be pour glazed or dip glazed. It really doesn't matter. Any of the three would work. When you want to use stain decoration, it really is better to sandwich it between two layers of Shainer's clear or to put it on top of a white glaze like Shing. And the reason for this is that the stains colors simply will not show up if you put them on a dark glaze like Andy's Shiny Black or St. John's Black or Deep Glossy Blue Green. They're just too dark. The values are too similar and your stains won't show up. They have to be with clear glaze or on top of a white glaze. The artist is spraying a little more glaze along the top edge there because when he went to pick it up, he chipped the top edge of the glaze. You've got to be careful of that. With these sprayed glazes, with any glaze, they're fragile along edges. You can pick up a spray glazed piece if your fingers are dry, and you kind of compress in on the side of the pot when you pick it up. But if you chip it anywhere, that's a problem and has to be fixed. Holding the pot on the side carefully so you don't chip glaze, you need to sponge glaze off the bottom of your pot. Remember, the glaze is going to melt. It's going to be molten in that high firing. And if it melts underneath the pot and then freezes up when the kiln cools, your pot's going to be stuck to the kiln shelf. So you always dry foot a pot. Look at any high fire pottery at the Park City Arts Festival next time you go. You'll see that all the high fire ware has been dry footed. Now when you spray glaze, you're pretty safe just sponging the bottom. You don't need to go up the outside edge much because spray glazes tend to hold still pretty well. Your spray gun needs to be cleaned out. First, dump your glaze back into the glaze bucket that it came from. Rinse out the spray can. Make sure there's no glaze left inside of it. Then you need to run water through the siphon straw in the spray gun assembly. And you need to watch the water run through. It needs to run through nice and clear. When it's running through clear, then you've got it rinsed off sufficiently. Put it together and put it away. Not only do you need to dry foot the bottom of a pot, but you also need to dry foot the edges of lids and the top edges of pots wherever they're touching. If you don't do this, your lid will glaze in place on your jar or teapot or whatever, and it will never come off. You must dry foot anything that is touching in high fire ware. The second glaze technique that we're going to show you today is dip glazing. So we'll show you dipping a glaze, stirring and testing the glaze, wetting the piece, dipping the piece, dry footing and cleaning feet, lids, rims, and we'll show you some variations like glaze over glaze, wax resist decoration, and sgraffito. The first step in dip glazing is to stir up your glaze. Remember that you must reach all the way to the bottom of the bucket and you must stir thoroughly all the way to the bottom. Glaze particles must be suspended evenly throughout all of the water. The test of your glaze is to dip a dry finger in, draw it out, take a look. It should show the shape of your fingernail but not your skin color. If it does, it's just right. It's best used for smooth pottery. If you have a heavily textured piece, you probably ought to spray glaze it. Otherwise, you'll get pinhole air bubbles all over the surface of the piece, and it will fill in the texture and hide it. But on a smooth piece, it works perfectly well. Now, you notice the artist is holding this jar bottom by the side, and he's dipping it so that it goes in halfway, glazing the inside and the outside at the same time. Watch again, holding the side of the lid, give it a little shake, get the excess drips off. There you go. A lot of potters quickly wet their pieces before they dip glaze so that they don't absorb too much glaze. Notice that this piece is starting to turn kind of chalky colored. When it turns chalky colored all over on that side, it can then be held with a dry hand on the dry side and you can dip the other half. Now don't just try to meet the first half, overlap it. Student artists are always asking if this is a bad thing to have a difference in the glaze color where the overlap marks are. Potters don't think that's a problem. We think it's a beautiful part of the glaze process, and we're not unhappy with glaze overlap marks. That's not a flaw in your piece. So do overlap it. Some potters even overlap it a slant or something to make it even more decorative. Remember, as we mentioned in the spray glazing portion of this, you need to dry foot by sponging the bottom of your piece. You also need to do a teeny bit up the outside edge to allow for the glaze to sag in the firing. Well dry-footed pot does not have any glaze left under the bottom when you're done cleaning it, so be thorough. Then the lid needs to be dry-footed. For this, the artist is going to use a little bit smaller sponge because the rim of the jar, rather. As you're doing this, you only want to get those areas where the lid and the jar are going to be touching. And you don't want to drip or change the surface of the glaze down out on the jar. So you need to kind of wring your sponge out, rinse it a number of times. And you can see it's starting to turn pink like this square. That means you're getting the glaze off. Is pretty much finished dry footing the jar portion of the piece and is now beginning to work on the inside edge of the lid. Frequently students will try to just dry foot the bottom edge of the lid and ask that we fire them separately, and we prefer not to do that for several reasons. One is that when you nestle the two together, as this lid and jar fit together, quite often if you leave glaze thickness in the piece, then when they're high fired and you put them back together, they'll no longer fit. And second, traditional thinking on lid and jars fitting together is that you will get a better fit if they fire together. And then if there's any slight warping in the high fire, they'll warp in the same fashion and still fit after the firing. So everywhere that the two are touching must be dry-footed. Now we're going to show you some dip glazing variations. The first one we're going to show you is glaze on glaze. Generally, when you do glaze on glaze, you want to select a glaze that's going to have some high contrast with the first glaze that you used. Stir your glaze and prepare it. Make sure it's the right consistency. And in this case, we're just going to dip the top of the lid. Keep it upside down for a little bit or you might get drips. You want to leave yourself some room because the double glazed area is going to flux. It's going to run a little bit more. It's going to sag. And so you usually don't want to do those glaze on glaze things right at the edge of a lid or right at the bottom of a pot because then it doesn't have room to flow a little bit without hitting the shelf and getting stuck or glazing your lid together. You don't want the glaze on glaze to be so thick that you start developing big cracks in the glaze. That's usually a sign that you have put way too much glaze on and it will probably crawl in the firing. The next dip glaze variation we're going to show you is wax resist decoration. Here the artist is pouring glaze through a strainer into a shallow tray. Okay, as he works the glaze through the strainer, he fills that rectangular tray up with glaze. This is where he's going to do his first color, is in the tray. Here the potter is showing you the wetting the pot first, which a lot of potters do, some don't, but many do. Going to dip the pot into his tray carefully, only putting a portion of it in. Not so far that it's going inside the pot, it's only on the outside. Okay, that part's done. Now remember, before we do the other side, we're going to need to let that side get nice and chalky dry. And that'll take a few moments. Okay, now both sides of the pot have been dipped. The potter will just wait now until both sides are chalky dry to do the next step. Right now, while the glaze is wet, you can do some dry footing. It's easier to sponge off while it's still pretty wet. The artist is beginning his wax resist decoration onto just the dipped portion. And it works pretty well while the wax is nice and wet. It works pretty well in your brush, but your brush will start to get kind of thick and viscous. It won't work as well if you'll clean it with a lot of soapy liquid soap and then some hot water while it's still liquid wax in the brush. You can get it clean. You need to be careful not to accidentally get some on a fingertip and touch some other part of your pot, or your pot will have a bare spot. The other thing that you can do to clean a brush that you've let go too long with wax is you can use turpentine on it and clean the wax out. But it's a lot easier to catch it early while it's still wet. There's a nice wax resist decoration on the piece. Now you don't dip it until that wax is dry. And don't try to blow dry it because the heat of the blow dryer keeps the wax from setting up. Notice that the design stays inside the glazed area. We don't go past the glazed area. If you do, you'll have a bare spot on your pot. Remember to clean up everything you use in the glazed area and put it away. Now that the wax is dry, the piece is ready to be dipped sideways half and half into a contrasting glaze color. The artist has decided to use Shing, which is a nice satin finish white glaze. That should be a nice contrast with that Bear Lake blue he started with. You notice how the glaze has resisted soaking in where the wax design is. Sometimes you'll need to take a little tiny sponge and dab some glaze droplets. Other times it's not that big a concern, you just have to decide. But if glaze is sticking quite a lot to your wax resist, you do need to sponge the droplets off because they'll melt and glaze in place later. Now on the other side, we're going to use this student pot that was left behind and glaze the other half, but we're going to show you sgraffito glaze decoration on that side. We have to wait just a moment though, let the glaze set up well on the wax resist side. The next one we're going to show you is sgraffito decoration using a special scratching tool. Sgraffito really means scratching too. It's just Latin, I think, for scratching. You're going to scratch through the top glaze layer and leave that first darker color showing through. Be careful not to scratch too far. You only want to scratch through the top layer, not all the way through to the bottom. You can see the dark lines starting to show up as he works on this piece. And those will continue to show after the piece is fired. Last demonstration you'll see in this glaze video is pour glazing. Again, we go through stirring and testing the glaze, wetting the piece if you desire to, pouring glaze inside the pot, pouring glaze outside the pot, and dry footing. Okay, here we have a pot that we were working on with some stain down in the texture earlier. Potter's decided that glaze was a little too thick. He's going to stir a little more water into it. Remember, you always stir and test your glaze before you begin. Okay, take a cup and pour several cupfuls of glaze into the inside of your pot. This is really one of the easiest ways to glaze the inside of a piece. Then as you pour the glaze back into the bucket, rotate it so that the entire inside gets coated with glaze. And the inside is thoroughly coated with glaze very easily. The potter has dipped the rim of the pot so that we'll have a nice finished lip. When you do stain down in the crevices of the piece, sometimes you can't get it all sponged off the surface, but if you're going to use like a clear glaze, like the potter is on this one, you want that as clean as possible off the surface. Sometimes you can use an eraser when the pot's drier and erase a lot of the stain off the surface so that you get less bleeding when you dip it or pour it. Pour glazing is done on a pot that is primarily a smooth surface, and it's usually a pot that's a little bit larger. It won't fit into the buckets or the tote trays to glaze. Notice that it's resting on a couple of sticks over a bucket. You can pour glaze upside down as well. Put a piece upside down and pour glaze. You can also put your hand inside the pot, hold it sideways, and pour your glaze sideways if you wish. You can see you do want a nice, even coat. Make sure you have plenty in the cup when you pour it. Okay, again, dry footing is essential. Sponge the bottom.